The first thing I remember was the smell. Not smoke exactly, at least not at first. It was something sharper, heavier, like burning plastic mixed with gasoline. The kind of smell that makes your stomach tighten before your brain even understands why. I had just turned onto my street when I saw the orange glow rising above the rooftops. At first I thought it was just the reflection of a sunset behind the houses. But the sun had already set. Then I heard the sirens. 3 fire trucks screamed past me in the opposite direction, their lights flashing violently against the quiet suburban houses. My stomach dropped. Something was wrong, very wrong, and for some reason, I already knew exactly where they were going. I turned the corner, and my worst fear hit me all at once. My house was on fire. Flames were roaring through the garage, like they had been waiting for air. Thick black smoke poured into the night sky, swallowing the stars above the neighborhood. The front windows had already shattered, and the fire inside glowed so bright it looked like the entire house had turned into a furnace. Firefighters were pulling hoses across the lawn, while neighbors gathered along the sidewalk, whispering, pointing, filming on their phones. I stopped the car in the middle of the street and just stared. You don't really process something like that right away. Your brain tries to tell you it must be someone else's house, that maybe the flames are just close, or the smoke is drifting from another property. But then you notice the mailbox, the driveway, the porch light you installed yourself last spring, and suddenly there's no denying it. Everything you own, everything you built, everything inside those walls is burning. A firefighter ran past me yelling for people to stay back as part of the roof collapsed with a loud crack that echoed through the street. Sparks shot into the air like a swarm of fireflies. Somewhere behind me, a neighbor gasped. But what bothered me the most wasn't the fire. It was the feeling that something about this night wasn't right, because fires don't just explode out of quiet houses in the middle of calm suburban neighborhoods, not without a reason. That's when I saw her. Standing across the street near the end of the sidewalk was Karen, our HOA president. Hands folded neatly in front of her, perfectly calm while everyone else looked horrified. The flashing emergency lights reflected in her glasses as she watched my house burn, like she was observing a fireworks show. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look concerned. If anything, she looked satisfied. Just 3 days earlier, we had been standing in my driveway, arguing about another one of her ridiculous HOA violations. She had threatened fines, legal action, even foreclosure over something as stupid as the color of a fence panel I had replaced after a storm. When I refused to back down, she leaned closer and whispered something I couldn't forget. "You're going to regret embarrassing me. At the time I thought it was just another empty threat from a power-hungry HOA president." But as the flames climbed through my roof and Karen stood there quietly watching, I started to realize that maybe it hadn't been a threat. Maybe it had been a promise. If you've never dealt with someone who believes a tiny bit of authority makes them untouchable, it's hard to understand how quickly a normal neighborhood can turn into a battlefield. Most people think homeowner associations exist to keep communities organized, trimmed lawns, clean sidewalks, maybe a few shared rules so the neighborhood looks nice. In theory, that's exactly what they're supposed to do. But when the wrong person ends up in charge, those small rules can become weapons. That's exactly what happened the year Karen became president of our HOA. At first, nobody really paid much attention. HOA elections in our neighborhood were usually quiet and uneventful. A handful of residents showed up, someone volunteered to take the position, and life went on. Karen had lived in the community for a few years already, and on the surface she seemed organized, polite, and extremely enthusiastic about improving property standards. Looking back, that enthusiasm should have been our first warning. Within a month of becoming president, Karen started sending out emails to the entire neighborhood, almost daily. Some were harmless reminders about trash collection days or landscaping guidelines, but slowly, the tone began to change. The emails got longer, stricter, more aggressive. Suddenly she was pointing out violations everywhere. A garden that looked too unkempt up, a basketball hoop that was not aesthetically consistent, a mailbox that was apparently the wrong shade of black. Most of us rolled our eyes and ignored it at first. People figured she was just excited about her new position and would calm down eventually, but instead of calming down, Karen doubled down. Soon the warning letters started appearing in mailboxes. Official HOA violation notices, fines, deadlines. Neighbors who had lived peacefully next to each other for years suddenly found themselves arguing about measurements of grass height or whether a trash bin had been visible from the street for too long. Some people quietly paid the fines just to avoid the headache. Others tried to reason with her. Neither approach worked. Karen wasn't interested in compromise. She was interested in control. And unfortunately for both of us, I ended up becoming her favorite target. It started with something incredibly small. After a bad storm passed through the area, one of the fence panels along the side of my yard was damaged. The wood had cracked, and the panel was leaning at an angle that made it look like the fence might collapse. So the next weekend I went to the hardware store, bought a replacement board, and fixed it. The repair took less than an hour. I didn't think about it again until 3 days later, when I found an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a violation notice from the HOA. According to Karen, the replacement fence panel didn't match the approved neighborhood color standard. The difference was barely noticeable unless you were standing a few feet away. But the letter made it sound like I had built a neon billboard in the middle of my yard. The notice demanded that I repaint the entire fence within 10 days or face a daily fine. At first, I honestly thought it was a joke. But when I checked my email, I found another message from Karen repeating the same complaint in far more dramatic language. She described the fence panel as visually disruptive to neighborhood harmony. She even included multiple photographs she had apparently taken while standing near my property line. That was the moment I realized something about Karen wasn't normal. Most HOA leaders try to avoid conflict. Karen seemed to enjoy creating it, so I responded politely. I explained that the fence repair was temporary and that repainting the entire structure would take some time. I also pointed out that HOA rules allowed reasonable repairs after storm damage. Her response arrived 20 minutes later. No greeting. No attempt at discussion. Just a short message informing me that the violation would stand and that fines would begin if I didn't comply immediately. From that point forward, it felt like she was watching my house constantly. Every week, there was a new complaint. My trash bin had been visible for too long after collection day. The grass in my backyard, which no one could even see from the street, was allegedly half an inch above the allowed height. At one point, she even emailed me about the position of my outdoor grill. Neighbors started noticing the pattern too. Some quietly mentioned that Karen seemed unusually focused on my property. Others admitted she had asked them questions about me during HOA meetings. It was as if she had decided I was the one resident she needed to bring under control. But the real confrontation happened one afternoon when I pulled into my driveway and saw Karen standing there taking pictures of my house with her phone. She didn't even try to hide it. When I asked what she was doing, she calmly told me she was documenting multiple violations. Her voice carried that same calm confidence I had noticed in her emails, the tone of someone who believed they were completely untouchable. I told her she needed to leave my prop. Right. That's when her expression changed. She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough that the neighbors nearby couldn't hear clearly. You seem to think HOA rules don't apply to you, she said. I told her rules were one thing, harassment was another. For a moment we just stood there in the driveway, staring at each other. Then she smiled in a way that didn't feel friendly at all. You'll regret embarrassing me, she said quietly. Then she turned around, walked back to her car, and drove away. At the time, I assumed it was just another empty threat from someone who had gotten used to people backing down. I had no idea that 3 days later, my house would be burning to the ground. There's a moment in every conflict where you realize the other person isn't going to stop. Not because they're right, not because they have authority, but because they have decided the fight itself is the point. And once I understood that about Karen, things in the neighborhood started making a lot more sense. At first, the violation notices had been annoying but manageable. A letter here, an email there, something you could roll your eyes at and ignore for a day or two. But after our confrontation in the driveway, the situation changed completely. The messages started coming faster, more aggressive, more personal. It felt like Karen had flipped a switch. The first sign was the emails. Instead of weekly reminders, they became daily reports. My inbox started filling up with long paragraphs about community standards and resident responsibilities. Every message included photographs she had taken of my property from different angles, as if she were building some kind of case file. One morning I woke up to 3 separate violation notices. The first claimed my trash bin had been visible from the street for too long after collection day. The second accused me of having a garden bed that looked overgrown. The third, my personal favorite, said my porch light was too bright and created visual disturbance for the neighborhood. The porch light had been installed by the previous owner years earlier. At that point, it stopped being about rules. It was harassment. Neighbors started noticing it too. A couple of them quietly mentioned that Karen had begun asking strange questions during HOA meetings. Questions about my schedule, about when I usually left for work, about how long my car stayed parked in the driveway. That's when I realized something else. Karen wasn't just filing complaints. She was watching my house. The next incident made that painfully clear. It was a Saturday afternoon, warm and quiet, the kind of day where most people were outside doing yard work or walking their dogs. I had just finished mowing the lawn when I noticed someone standing near the sidewalk at the edge of my property. Karen. She was holding her phone up, slowly turning in a circle while taking pictures of my house. Not quick photos either. Careful ones, like she was documenting every inch. I walked over and asked what she was doing. She didn't even seem embarrassed. Instead, she calmly told me she was conducting a routine inspection for the HOA. Her voice had that same calm authority she used in her emails, like everything she did was automatically justified because of her position. I reminded her that routine inspections didn't include standing on someone's property, taking pictures without permission. She tilted her head slightly, almost amused. The HOA has the right to ensure community standards are being followed, she replied. That sentence alone told me everything I needed to know about how she saw the neighborhood. Not as a community of homeowners, not as neighbors living side by side, but as territory she controlled. I told her again to leave. For a second it looked like she might argue, but instead she slowly lowered her phone and stepped closer. Close enough that I could see the irritation in her eyes behind that forced smile. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said. I asked her what that was supposed to mean. Her smile disappeared. "You could have just fixed the fence," she continued quietly. "You could have followed the rules like everyone else." I reminded her that repairing storm damage didn't require permission. That's when the tension in the air changed completely. She leaned a little closer, lowering her voice so the neighbors working in their yards couldn't hear clearly. "You embarrassed me at the HOA meeting," she said. I suddenly remembered exactly what she meant. 2 weeks earlier, she had tried to publicly fine me during a meeting for the fence issue. I had calmly pointed out that the HOA guidelines actually allowed temporary repairs after storm damage and asked her to show the specific rule she was referencing. She couldn't. Several neighbors had quietly laughed when she tried flipping through the rule book, searching for something that wasn't there. Karen clearly hadn't forgotten that moment. "You think this is funny?" she asked. I told her I thought she was abusing her position. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The only sound was a lawnmower running somewhere down the street. Then Karen took a slow breath and straightened her posture again. That polite HOA president mask returned to her face like someone flipping a switch, but her eyes were different. Cold. Cold. "You'll regret embarrassing me," she said quietly. Not yelling, not angry, just calm. Then she turned around, walked back to her car, and drove away like nothing had happened. I stood there in the driveway for a long time after she left. At the time, I told myself it was just another threat, the kind people make when they're frustrated and want to scare someone into backing down. But the strange feeling in my stomach didn't go away. Something about the way she said those words felt different, like she wasn't bluffing, like she had already decided exactly how she was going to teach me a lesson. 3 days later, in the middle of the night, my phone rang, and a neighbor's panicked voice told me my house was on fire. The call came a little after midnight. At first, I didn't even recognize the number. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was some late-night spam call or a wrong number. But something made me answer anyway. The voice on the other end was panicked. "Your house is on fire." For a moment, my brain refused to process the words. I sat up in bed, half awake, staring into the darkness of the room, like maybe I had misheard them. "What?" I asked. "Your house," the neighbor repeated, breathless. "There's smoke everywhere. Fire trucks are on the way. You need to get here." Adrenaline hit instantly. I was out the door in less than 30 seconds. I barely remember grabbing my keys or throwing on shoes. My mind was racing the entire drive back to the neighborhood. Every red light felt like it lasted 10 minutes. The streets were empty, silent, but in the distance I could already see something glowing faintly in the sky. An orange glow. And with every block I drove closer, that glow got brighter. When I turned onto my street, the scene looked like something out of a disaster movie. Flames were already tearing through the side of my house. Thick black smoke rolled upward into the night, while sparks drifted through the air like glowing snow. Firefighters were dragging hoses across the yard, shouting instructions to each other, while water blasted against the walls and windows. The garage was completely engulfed. I stopped. The car so suddenly I barely remembered turning the engine off. For a second, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at the house like maybe it wasn't real. But the heat coming off the flames was real. The crackling of wood collapsing inside the structure was real. Everything I owned was inside those walls. Furniture, photos, documents, years of memories, all of it disappearing behind a curtain of smoke and fire. A firefighter rushed toward me as I stepped out of the car. "You can't go any closer," he said firmly. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to save anyway. The flames were already pouring through the windows, and a section of the roof sagged dangerously as the fire spread deeper inside. Neighbors were gathered along the sidewalks, watching the chaos unfold. Some were whispering, some were filming with their phones. Others just stood there, in stunned silence. Then something strange caught my attention. The fire didn't look like it had started inside the house. The worst damage was near the garage door and along the side wall closest to the driveway. The flames there were brighter, more aggressive, like they had been fed something extra. Even someone with no firefighting experience could see it. This wasn't a small accident in the kitchen. This looked deliberate. A loud crack suddenly echoed through the street as one of the front windows shattered outward, sending sparks flying across the lawn. A firefighter shouted for everyone to move farther back as part of the roof above the garage collapsed inward. People gasped, but while everyone else was reacting with shock or concern, I noticed someone standing very still across the street. Karen. She was standing near the curb with her arms folded calmly in front of her. The flashing red and blue emergency lights reflected off her glasses while she watched the flames consuming my house. Most people in that situation would look horrified. Karen didn't. She looked fascinated. Our eyes met for just a second across the street. and for a brief moment I saw something in her expression that made the back of my neck tighten. Satisfaction, not sympathy. Not concern. Satisfaction. She quickly looked away when she realized I was staring, pretending to focus on the firefighters instead. But the damage had already been done. That tiny moment of eye contact had planted a thought in my mind that refused to go away. 3 days earlier, she had stood in my driveway making threats. Now my house was burning in the middle of the night. The timing was too perfect. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the firefighters finally started gaining control of the blaze. By then, the house was already a destroyed shell of blackened wood and twisted metal. Smoke drifted through the air as water continued spraying over the remaining hot spots. One of the fire investigators walked slowly around the driveway area, shining a flashlight across the ground near the garage. He crouched down. Then he called another investigator over. They spoke quietly for a moment before marking a section of pavement with bright yellow evidence tape. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their expressions told me everything. This wasn't just a house fire, it was something much worse. Later that night, one of the investigators finally approached me while the firefighters packed up their equipment. "We're going to need to ask you a few questions," he said. I nodded, still staring at the smoking remains of the house. "There are signs the fire may have started outside near the garage," he continued carefully. "We also found traces that suggest an accelerant might have been used. Accelerant, gasoline, arson." The word hung in the air, even though he didn't say it directly. My mind immediately flashed back to Karen standing across the street, watching the fire like it was entertainment, and suddenly her quiet threat from 3 days earlier echoed in my head. "You'll regret embarrassing me." At the time I thought she was just angry. Standing there in the smoke of my burned home, I started to wonder if she had meant something very different. And if she had, this story was far from over. The strange thing about arson investigations is that the truth usually hides in small details, not dramatic confessions or obvious clues like people expect from movies. Instead, it's little things, tiny observations that don't seem important until someone starts connecting them together. The morning after the fire, I was standing in what used to be my driveway, staring at the wreckage, when one of the investigators approached me again. The house was nothing but a blackened frame now. The smell of smoke still hung thick in the air, and water from the fire hoses had turned the yard into a muddy mess. He introduced himself as part of the fire investigation unit. Then he asked a simple question. "Has anyone threatened you recently?" That question made my stomach tighten because there was only one person who immediately came to mind. Karen. I told him about the HOA dispute, the fence panel, the endless violation notices, the confrontation in the driveway where she had leaned close and told me I would regret embarrassing her. The investigator didn't interrupt. He just listened and wrote notes. When I finished, he nodded, slowly. "You're not the first person in the neighborhood to mention her name," he said. That caught my attention immediately. Apparently, once word spread that the fire might not have been accidental, people in the neighborhood started talking. Quietly at first, then more openly. And once they started talking, stories about Karen began piling up. Several neighbors had heard her arguing with me earlier that week. One neighbor specifically remembered her voice carrying across the street while she complained loudly about teaching certain residents a lesson. Another neighbor had noticed something even more interesting. Around 11:30 the night of the fire, they had been out walking their dog when a car slowly drove past my house. The street was quiet at that hour, so the movement stood out. The car didn't stop, but it slowed down near my driveway before continuing down the road. The neighbor didn't recognize the driver at the time, but they did recognize the car. It belonged to Karen. When investigators later asked if they were sure, the neighbor explained that Karen's car had a distinctive dent near the rear bumper that made it easy to identify. Suddenly, the timeline started looking very different. But the real turning point came 2 days later. One of the houses across the street had recently installed a security camera above their garage. At first, the homeowner didn't think to check it because the camera mainly faced their own driveway. However, when investigators asked neighbors about cameras in the area, they reviewed the footage anyway, and that's when things got interesting. The camera didn't capture my house directly, but it did record the street. At 11:42 p.m., a car appeared in the footage slowly driving down the road. The video quality wasn't perfect, but the shape and color of the vehicle were clear enough. It was Karen's car. Even stranger, the vehicle stopped briefly near my driveway before continuing down the street. The footage didn't show anyone leaving the car, but the timing alone raised serious questions, because the first emergency call reporting the fire came at 12:06 a.m., less than 30 minutes later. When investigators came back to speak with me that, hey, fair noon, they didn't reveal every detail right away. But I could tell from the way they asked questions that the situation was escalating quickly. They asked if Karen had ever entered my property before. Yes. They asked if she had ever taken photographs of the house. Yes. They asked if she seemed angry during our last argument. Very. Then one of them mentioned something else. Traces of gasoline had been detected near the garage where the fire started. Gasoline that had clearly been poured along the base of the wall. That wasn't an accident. That was planning. By the third day after the fire, the mood in the neighborhood had completely changed. What started as sympathy for a tragic house fire had turned into quiet suspicion spreading through every conversation. People were whispering. People were remembering things, small details that suddenly seemed important. And Karen? Karen had gone strangely quiet. No HOA emails. No violation notices. No dramatic neighborhood announcements. It was like she had completely disappeared. But investigators hadn't forgotten about her. Late Friday afternoon, while I was meeting with my insurance adjuster, my phone rang again. This time the number belonged to the local police department. The officer on the line spoke calmly. "We'd like you to know we've identified a suspect in the arson investigation." My heart started pounding immediately. I already knew the answer. Still, I asked the question. "Who?" There was a brief pause. Then the officer said, the name I had been expecting since the night of the fire. Karen. But what happened next was something I never could have predicted, because exactly 1 week later, Karen would walk into a courtroom and realize the person sitting behind the judge's bench was me. A week after my house burned down, I walked into the courthouse expecting a normal day. Die. It might sound strange, considering everything that had happened, but routine has a way of pulling you forward, even when your life feels like it's been flipped upside down. The insurance paperwork, the investigation, the endless phone calls, none of that stopped the calendar. My job still existed. Cases were still scheduled. Court was still in session. So that morning I put on my robe, walked into the courtroom, and took my seat behind the bench just like I had done hundreds of times before. From the outside, it probably looked like any other day. Inside, though, things felt different. My house was gone. Everything I owned had been reduced to ashes only 7 days earlier. Even now, the smell of smoke seemed permanently stuck in my clothes, no matter how many times I washed them. But sitting in that courtroom forced me to focus on something else for a few hours. Law, procedure, order. The clerk began calling the morning cases, one by one. Most of them were routine. Traffic violations, minor disputes, the usual things that fill a local court schedule. I handled them the same way I always did, listening carefully, reviewing documents, making decisions based on the law rather than emotion. But then the clerk paused before announcing the next case. She glanced down at the paperwork in front of her, then looked up toward me with a slightly confused expression. For a brief second, I thought something had gone wrong with the schedule. Then she read the name, State versus Karen Whitmore. The name hit me like a sudden electric shock. Karen. I kept my expression neutral, but my mind was racing instantly. I hadn't been involved in the investigation directly since giving my statement to the fire investigators. I knew they were building a case, but I hadn't expected anything to move this fast. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked Karen. For the first time since tea, night of the fire, I was seeing her up close again, but she didn't look like the confident HOA president who had stood in my driveway issuing threats. Her posture was stiff, her eyes darted nervously around the room. She was dressed more formally than usual, like someone trying very hard to appear respectable under bad circumstances. At first, she didn't notice me. She stepped towards the defense table beside her attorney, adjusting the papers in her hands, as if this was just another inconvenience she expected to talk her way out of. Then she looked up and froze. The moment her eyes landed on me sitting behind the judge's bench, the color drained from her face. For a second, she didn't move at all. You could practically see the realization forming in her mind, the pieces connecting together one by one. The memory of our arguments, the threats she had made, the house she had watched burn, and now this, the courtroom where her case was being heard. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I could see the panic building behind her eyes as she tried to process the situation. Her attorney leaned closer, whispering something to her, probably asking if she was okay. But Karen was still staring straight at me. She knew exactly who I was. And now she understood exactly who I was. And now she understood exactly whose courtroom she had just walked into. The prosecutor stood and began reading the charges. The words echoed through the room with calm precision. Arson in the first degree, destruction of property, reckless endangerment. Karen's breathing grew noticeably faster. Her attorney quickly stood to request a private conversation with his client, clearly realizing there was a serious conflict of interest developing in real time. From a legal standpoint, the situation was complicated. Judges can't preside over cases where they're personally involved. But that didn't stop the reality of the moment from settling heavily in the room. Karen had spent months abusing her authority in a neighborhood HOA, convinced that she could intimidate and control the people around her. She had threatened me, harassed me, and according to the investigation, she had taken that anger so far that she burned my house to the ground. Now she stood in a courtroom, facing criminal charges. And the first judge she saw when she walked through those doors was the person she had tried to destroy. Her confident smile from the night of the fire was gone. In its place was something very different, fear, because for the first time since this whole conflict started, Karen was the one standing in a place where the rules actually mattered. And no amount of HOA authority was going to help her here. As the attorneys began discussing the necessary legal procedures, Karen slowly lowered her eyes from the bench. The woman who once spoke to everyone in the neighborhood like she controlled their lives now looked smaller somehow. But deep down, I knew something important. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the moment when Karen finally realized the consequences of what she had done were real. And very soon she was going to learn exactly how real they were. There is a moment in every courtroom where the reality of the situation finally sinks in for the person standing on the wrong side of the law. You can see it in their posture, in the way their confidence slowly drains away as the evidence starts stacking up piece by piece. For Karen, that moment came faster than she expected. After the initial hearing, the case was reassigned to another judge because of my connection to the situation. That's standard procedure. Justice isn't about personal revenge, and the legal system has strict rules to make sure cases stay fair. But even though I wouldn't be the one delivering the final verdict, the case itself moved forward quickly. And the evidence kept growing. Investigators had already found traces of gasoline near the garage where the fire started. Laboratory testing confirmed it wasn't just residue from household items. It had been poured deliberately along the base of the wall. The burn pattern made that clear, but that alone wasn't enough to prove who had done it. What really started tightening the case was the timeline. The security camera footage from across the street showed Karen's car slowly driving past my house less than 30 minutes before the first emergency call reporting the fire. When investigators enhanced the footage, the distinctive dent near her rear bumper matched perfectly. Then came the witness statements. The neighbor walking their dog confirmed seeing the same car slowing down near my driveway that night. Another resident described hearing Karen angrily talking about teaching someone a lesson. Earlier that week, during an HOA dispute, even Karen's own emails became part of the investigation. When detectives reviewed her messages to me, they saw the pattern immediately. Weeks of escalating hostility, threats about consequences, and that final message after our confrontation. The tone wasn't just annoyed anymore. It sounded personal, very personal. As the case moved toward trial, Karen's situation became harder and harder to explain away. At first, she tried to claim coincidence. Her attorney argued that driving down the street didn't mean she had anything to do with the fire. After all, she lived in the same neighborhood. But the timing looked terrible, and investigators had discovered something else. Earlier that evening, a nearby gas station camera had recorded Karen's car pulling up to one of the pumps. The footage showed her filling a red gasoline container and placing it in the trunk before driving away. That detail changed everything. By the time the preliminary hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed. News about the case had spread quickly through the community. A local HOA president accused of burning down a neighbor's house wasn't exactly an everyday headline. Karen walked in looking nothing like the confident woman who used to patrol the neighborhood handing out violation notices. Her shoulders were tight. Her face looked pale and exhausted, and for the first time since I had known her, she wasn't the one giving orders. The prosecutor began presenting the evidence step by step: security footage, witness testimony, the gas station video, the fire investigation report explaining exactly how the accelerant had been used to start the blaze. Karen sat silently while the details unfolded. At one point, she glanced toward the back of the courtroom, where I was seated quietly among the observers. Our eyes met briefly before she quickly looked away. The same woman who once threatened me in my own driveway now couldn't even hold eye contact. When the hearing ended, the judge ruled that there was more than enough evidence for the case to move forward to trial. Karen was taken into custody that afternoon. Handcuffs replaced the confident gestures she used to make during HOA meetings. Cameras from local news crews captured the moment she was escorted out of the courthouse doors, while reporters shouted questions she refused to answer. Weeks later, the trial concluded with the outcome most people had already expected. The evidence was overwhelming. Karen was convicted of arson and property destruction. The judge handed down a prison sentence that ensured she wouldn't be returning to that quiet suburban neighborhood anytime soon. In the months that followed, life slowly began moving forward again. The insurance settlement allowed me to rebuild on the same property. Construction crews replaced the burned structure with a new home, stronger and safer than the one before. Neighbors who had once stayed silent about Karen's behavior began talking openly about how relieved they felt, knowing the situation was finally over. As for the HOA, new leadership was elected not long after the trial. The meetings became quiet again. The endless violation notices stopped appearing in mailboxes. The neighborhood went back to being just a neighborhood. Sometimes when I drive down the street late at night, I remember standing there watching flames tear through everything I owned. I remember the smoke, the sirens, and the strange, calm expression Karen had while she watched the fire. Back then, she believed she was untouchable. She thought her authority as HOA president meant she could control people without consequences. But the truth about power is simple. It only works until you meet someone who answers to a higher set of rules. And in the end, Karen didn't lose her position in the HOA. She lost something far more important: her freedom. Karen